Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending our first lecture series. This is a new program within Theosophical, and then we're gonna keep it monthly for now. And then if the material is getting more fluid, maybe we can do it even more often. Okay. So this lecture service is can happen with collaboration of Open Heart School. And then for Open Heart Toronto, Freda is the head of Toronto. So I just want to give the a brief description of Open Heart Group. It is a community of people who share common interests in exploring topics related to health, well-being, and spirituality. We meet regularly to have an open and honest discussion, learn from each other, and support each other in our personal journey. We have about 25 members at the moment within Toronto, and then about a dozen who attend regularly. We host annual retreat cottage country where we meditate, practice yoga, hike mountain, have engaging conversation, and share the meals. I had the privilege to join the last retreat. It was very, very great because we stay in a what is it like?
Cottage.
Yeah, in cottages, and then between cottages you have to take a boat. So it's very, very cool. Yeah. And then whenever we have to do activity, for example, like a yoga, it's always by the water, like from somebody's porch. Yeah. It's really, really nice. And then we also instruct a small student with a greater interest in spiritual growth and service. The purpose of Open Heart School is to expand consciousness of each participant and attendees. It offers platform for personal growth on all the vehicle of expression, like physical or etheric, emotional, and mental. We help our participants to both learn about the soul and then how to build the connection. The mission statement of Open Heart School is to share love. The mission is to feel the love within our hearts and share this beautiful energy with our families, with our members, our communities, and the world through our weekly Open Heart meditation. Now I would like to introduce Freda Kemp. Freda.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah. A little bit about Freda. So Freda is a long-time student of Ageless Wisdom, having studied with the Center of Esoteric Studies, University of Seven Ray, and Academy of Synthesis. Freda has taught spirituality and then led full moon, equinox, solstice meditation for over 25 years. She's the founder of Open Heart School in Toronto, acts as a spiritual mentor for many seekers on the path, including myself. And then, like personal note on Freda, Freda is the person who able to broke me in terms of saying I love you. Because I told Freda, even like I never say I love you to my parents, but then we love each other. But then I always feel it's very uncomfortable for me to express it. And then yeah, you're the first one in a letter or in a text as like love you, Daniel. That's it. I haven't not done it to my mother. So now I start doing it to my mother. So that's the first note. And the second note is I'm so amazed with Freda's activity. She's a ski instructor up to now. Yeah. So yeah, don't let you your vision fool you about her stamina. It's amazing. Okay.
Thank you, Daniel. That was really, really nice. Well, welcome everybody. I'm really delighted to be here and to work with Daniel and the Theosophical Society to launch this lecture series. So as Daniel mentioned, we have a really good lecture every single month, excluding the summer. And our next speaker will be Eva Smith, who is just an amazing esoteric teacher and so knowledgeable on so many different topics. So maybe Daniel can just read out her topic at the end of my lecture today. So here we are to look at a spiritual biography of this kind of wild and crazy looking guy, Manley P. I based my talk today on this book, which is The Master of Mysteries. And it is a biography. It's like some biographies of spiritual people. It was really written by a non-spiritual person. So it's really a chronicle of his life, but his life was pretty amazing. So the story, it reads like a novel. So if you do have an interest in learning more about it, this is a good place to start. So why look at a spiritual biography of anyone? Well, if we think about it, we know we have ashrams, we have spiritual hierarchy, but one of the hypotheses we have that each location, each community, each city, each province, country, even continent, and of course the world itself, but we're dealing in subunits of the world, has its own spiritual leaders and guides. And so by doing a spiritual biography of someone we hypothesize might be one of these spiritual leaders of our community, in this case, Manley P, but there's so many other people that we could look at. What we're trying to do is discover and to kind of unlock and unfold the spiritual teachers of our country. Now, we would all say that, okay, if we're looking at the Americas, we have Saint Germain, who is clearly one of the guides and the leaders of this country. But, he's a hierarchical being, and let's get a little more grounded and look at real people who've lived here, who've been these kind of pioneers in spiritual movement. So we might call them our elders, right? They're the ones, and I believe Manley P. I think he would represent someone who would be a guide for all of North America. We're going to learn soon. He was born in Canada, but he spent most of his life in the US. So by doing this, we connect, we kind of create this line of energy. We're sort of thinking about Manley P. and then we're attracting his attention to us. So that's what we're doing when we're working on the spiritual biography. And lastly, we're kind of sending our appreciation, just like we might appreciate Blavatsky, right? She was a spiritual teacher and guide, or Dolores, who's behind me, overlooking me here. Just by reading about their works, by talking about their life, we are sending that appreciation back to them. Okay, let's have the first slide. So I'm going to start with what I think is a really good quote by Manley P. He says, "We need holy men and women to assist in the establishment of higher standards of right and wrong, to amend unjust laws on our statute books, to become the patrons of broader and nobler education ideals, to foster the cause of world peace, to aid in the achievement of economic justice, and most of all, provide the millions of this generation with a workable, livable philosophy of life." And that might, stand as his objective as well. He was certainly a remarkable person, and as I mentioned, he lived a remarkable life. He was, by any stretch of the imagination, the very definition of philosopher. He was constantly searching for meaning in the world's wisdom traditions. He was a consummate teacher, and he took his deep learning, as we were talking about just before we got started, and made it accessible and compelling for listeners. And he did that for over 70 years. He attained an amazing degree of scholarship in so many branches of human evolution. And he was able to speak extemporaneously. He could speak for over 2 hours. So we kind of talked about this, and some of you, I think, have said that you've seen him on YouTube, right? He speaks eloquently, he's very clear, He manages to use language that's very accessible. So he doesn't give you that kind of esoteric feeling. Because so many people are turned off by esotericism because it's using obtuse language and it just uses terminology that people don't understand. He was the opposite. He brought everything down to earth so it was clear and easy to understand. He also traveled extensively, as we'll see, and he amassed a huge library. And that was important at the time. Remember, we're pre-internet, you know, the only way you were going to find out information is through a book or through direct teaching by a spiritual master or someone who's a clear disciple. He went way beyond what the average person ever understood. He was able to combine spirituality, science, art, and philosophy, and as you say, make it understandable. And because he lived in California, he was there at the sort of the dawn of the age of Hollywood. So he had very much had an influence in Hollywood as well. He was basically a celebrity in his day. So let's have a look at his astrological chart. Sorry, next slide. So this is his chart, and I'll just start with a caveat that I'm not a great astrologer, but there's a lot, if you do know a bit about astrology, that you can see in this chart. The first thing we're going to look at is his sun sign. So his sun sign is in Pisces, but he also has Mercury and Venus located in his birth signs. So Pisces would point to great sensitivity and a great mystical kind of bent. So, and that is reinforced by the Mercury and the Venus in that sign. The other interesting thing is he has Uranus conjunct the midheaven in the 11th house. Do you want me to point to these things? Can you see
Yes.
Can you see them on the chart? Okay, so here we have Mercury, it's conjunct the midheaven, okay? And it's in the, you see the house, this is the 11th house, okay? So what does that mean? It means that it points to kind of an unconventional and eclectic kind of a life, unusual career. In the 11th house, that means it's on the public stage, okay? And we've also heard his incredible amount of knowledge on mysticism, philosophy, and ancient history. So that is pointed to in that part of the chart. The next part that's interesting is he has the moon here, is conjunct his ascendant, and it's on what's called the world axis here. So what does that mean? This means that it's in Aquarius. Sorry, I should have mentioned that. It's in Aquarius. So this is significant because he's able to merge the past, which is the moon, the present, and the future, and bring these Aquarian values. Aquarian values are really pointing to the future. This is significant for somebody who really helps set the stage and educate future leaders of the Aquarian age. And I don't have this written up, but we have Pluto and Neptune in Gemini. Where's that? Down here. These two are conjunct, okay? In Gemini. So Gemini is the sign of communication. So what this says is it gives him a powerful and persuasive communication skills. And he could speak, we've heard, he could speak extemporaneously on diverse topics for hours at a time. And he certainly could make the complex subjects clear and understandable to anyone. He had Saturn conjunct Jupiter in Capricorn in the 11th house. So let's go back and look at that. So here we have Saturn and Jupiter. This is kind of an odd combination. You can think of it sometimes as a push me, pull you. Jupiter is positive and expansive, and Saturn is constraining, and it's about time. But I think for him, this shows that he first of all had good fortune. We'll see that when we continue in this biography. And Saturn looked to the time, tradition, right? He was always drawing on ancient wisdom or the past. So I think that was where he used both the Capricorn, both the Saturn and the Jupiter. They weren't in conflict. They were combined and worked together. And we can see that also in his relationship with secret societies, which is kind of pointed to there by the Capricorn. He's able to bring these philosophies out to the world, to a broad audience. And finally, he has Mars, which is over here, opposite his ascendant. And Mars is a planet of energy and power. And I think that gave him the ability to push through opposition. If you see his life as kind of a charmed life, he really didn't have too many obstacles in his life. So this was partially, I think, because he had so much power to fulfill his mission, which is over here on the ascendant. I'd say any questions, but I probably couldn't answer this one. I won't do that. Okay, next slide. So first of all, his early life. This was very unconventional. As I mentioned, he's born in Canada. He was born in Peterborough, Ontario. His mother was a chiropractor. So think he's born in 1901, but his mother's a chiropractor. And his father is a dentist. But for some reason, their marriage just did not get off the ground, did not succeed. The father just, disappeared. We never hear about him again. And his mother, who's despondent at her mother, and takes off to Alaska to be a chiropractor. And we don't hear about her till a little later in the story. So he no sooner gets with his grandmother, who's really, being his mother in a way, because he's just a baby. But her husband dies, and she's a very unconventional person. So she picks up the 4-year-old and she takes him to the United States. And I think she's kind of a remarkable woman. She obviously was restrained in her life in Peterborough. But once she had her freedom, she wandered all over the United States, going to all these interesting places. They would go to Native Indian powwows. She went to the Wild West show. She took him to circuses, political rallies. They moved around. They never stayed in one place for very long. And she never sent him to school until quite late. They would read together. They would read Victor Hugo together. So he was reading by the age of 3, and he was reading major novels by the age of 3. They said in 1914, he went to Washington, and they were living in a boarding house. And he met a Spanish faith healer. And she really impressed him. And she had this powerful prayer that he used to like to listen to. 3 wise men came out of the east, Melchior, Gaspar, and Balthazar. Go heat, come cold, go heat. Praise Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So she was able to heal serious burns using this kind of powerful prayer that she would. And he was just like, in awe, mesmerized by her. Next slide, please. So by his adolescence, at 16, which I guess is the age of your average high school student now, he went to work, started working in an insurance company. And he was really appalled because one of the fellows there, he's 47, he passes away. And, there's not really much fanfare. And here the guy had given his whole life to this company. And he was just like, oh, well, he's gone, too bad. So he was not impressed with this, typical Wall Street kind of firm. They say one day he wandered into a magician shop that was in New York. And he used to love meeting the magicians. He'd hang out there, they'd sit around after they did their shows, and they just talk. They talk about magic, and not just the magic, which was the illusion magic, but real magic. And that's what was grabbing his attention, this idea that, hey, there is real magic in the world. And they say he even met Harry Houdini there, and Harry Houdini showed him one of his tricks. So I think at this point he was getting very dissatisfied with kind of this traditional life. And just then his grandmother passes away. So he has another little crisis in his life. And next slide, please. He gets back in touch with his mother. And at this time his mother was living in California. So he moves to California. And now here's something curious I couldn't quite grasp. But Louise Hall, his mother, had she'd worked at the gold fields, and she'd met her second husband, Charles, and she married him, and he took her name. So that's kind of remarkable. So there's something about her being a really, we would call her a feminist, but of course this is in 1919. There was no such idea other than a little bit of suffragette principles there. So she was very much ahead of her time. And they didn't seem to have any animosity. There was no, "Your mom, you left me, you know, I'm so sad. Why did you abandon me?" And they just seemed to pick up their relationship and carry on. So I think what was going on there is he was given the opportunity to develop as almost as an independent person without real parents other than his grandmother. And he was given a kind of very unusual and kind of eclectic education in his younger years. So he really thrived in his new home. Obviously, his mother was interested in what they called utopian religions, but going to Ojai, which in San Diego, there were so many different spiritual groups at that time that were starting up in California. It was like a hotbed of spirituality, really, in that time. And she loved it, and obviously he picked up her love as well. Next slide, please. So here we see his first teacher. His teacher is his name is Sidney J. Brownson. And he was quite an older man at the time. He'd fought in the Civil War. He was a doctor, but he was very much knowledgeable on metaphysical topics. And he had his own sort of spiritual awakening on the battlefield during the Civil War. It's one of those mystical experiences that sort of overtake you. And this lasted for him a day and a night. So they formed a kind of a mentor-student relationship. And it was Brownson that got Hall to do his first talk. And so he did a talk on reincarnation to a small audience, but that really got him started on his speaking career. And once started, I don't think you could stop him. I think he just kept talking for the rest of his life. So for him, everything was kind of falling into place. Everything was going his way. He was back together with his mother. He was living in kind of this new version of the California dream. Now he's only, next slide, please. Now he's only 19 years old, but this speaking that he's doing attracts the attention of a kind of a spiritual church called the Church of the People. And, next one. And he's invited to come in and speak at this Church of the People. And in late 1919, their pastor goes on a kind of a vacation, and he's asked to come in as sort of the step-in pastor. So these were adults he was talking to. They were intellectuals, socialists, utopians, vegetarians. I guess big deal with the vegetarian back then, I guess. So young people. So we would think of it as a really open-minded, new age kind of group in this church. And he's running the church, and that also means he has to take on the duties of counseling. So there he is counseling people that were old enough to be his grandparents on how they should live their lives. So he obviously had a lot of chutzpah, and he was able to step into any role and just take it on and do it. So he also encouraged at this time them to explore theosophy. So we can see that theosophy was starting to come into his consciousness, and he was reading and learning a lot about theosophy at the time. The next slide. Okay, I'll start talking and then the slide will come. How's that? So his second teacher is quite an interesting woman. Her name is August Heimdall, and she was the wife of a fairly famous theosophical person or luminary by the name of Max Heimdall. He was both a Christian mystic and a German immigrant. And he'd had one of his own awakening experiences as well. But he made it from to California. He was actually Danish to start out with. And he met Leadbeater. He was definitely a theosophist. He was a vegetarian. He traveled, he met Steiner. So he was very knowledgeable about theosophy. And he'd written his own book called The Rosicrucian Cosmo Concept, which was very well received. So he was extremely knowledgeable about theosophy and bringing out his own ideas and thoughts on the topic as well. He had this interesting revelation in that he met the leader of the Rosy Cross, and so this wasn't a physical meeting; this was a spiritual meeting, and he was somewhere near Germany and what we would call Bavaria, I think. He had this sort of spiritual awakening and download of a whole bunch of information, which was contained in his book. So he was both an early Rosicrucian, but not in the tradition. He was sort of taking his knowledge directly from the inner group of the Rosy Cross, as he called them. So he was inspired, and he was doing this inspired kind of writing. Now, he died before Manley P met him. So the only person he actually met was Augusta, who was his wife. And they'd established a center in this Mount Ecclesia in California. She sort of adopted him as her protege, and she started really, giving him a great deal of education. So now he had kind of I think a more mature and more prominent kind of teacher to guide his development. Now, going back to, next slide. Going back to his days as a pastor, they loved him so much that in 1923 that he was ordained as a minister of this church, and he was made the permanent pastor basically. And they gave him this beautiful cross that you can see. This is the Rosicrucian cross that he designed, but it was very expensive. It was made of diamonds, platinum, gold. So it was, you can imagine this is in the 20s. So when I look at his life, and we're going to go to back at the end of this talk and look at what some of his initiatory moments were, we might look at this as being an initiatory moment where he's given this symbolic cross, and he's also given this significant position as pastor of this church. And remember, he's only 22 at this. Next slide. He also takes up publishing. This time he moves out of his parents' or mother's home, and he begins publishing this All-Seeing Eye, which you can see if you see the small print. It was 25 cents a copy, which I'm sure was a lot. And he moves in with the young, so he's kind of stepping out on his own. They help him out by giving him a place to live, and they also help him with the publishing of this magazine, which I think be nice to hear that you might have some copies of this in the library or something. It'd be kind of cool. Okay, next slide. So this is Los Angeles, which, if we think of California, even today, we think of California as being, a leader in the spiritual movement, right? You could almost say the New Age kind of got its kickoff in terms of public expression in California. It was really a hotbed of spiritual and esoteric groups. All kinds of groups were going there and establishing centers. Rosicrucians, Masons, other groups, and in addition, healers, psychics, astrologers, followers of all these people. It was really quite an amazing place. And we can almost think of it as he called it Los Angeles is the greenhouse of America. He says it is a place of experimentation in which we are combining facts and producing new species. It is primarily fitted to be the greatest cultural center of the world, a city that is sacred in being, a nucleus where the final principles of life can come into expression. Now, we might not say that about Los Angeles today, but I think it had that opportunity in that early 20s and 30s to be this cradle of the new civilization or the Aquarian age. Next slide. And I even thought when I was writing this, that would be a good book, wouldn't it? If you surveyed all these different spiritual groups that started, their life in California, or really, came to fruition in California. I think it had a combination of good weather, great economics, and this spirit of newness, openness, right? Exactly. So here's the other very fortunate thing, and so I'll remember that thing I had said about his Jupiter. Very fortunate. he attracts these benefactors. So their names are Caroline and Alma Lloyd. They're a mother and daughter. And they just so happen to be the recipients of an oil field in Ventura County in California. So they're fabulously wealthy. And they take him in, you know, he comes to speak at their house and they become his benefactors. They give him substantial amounts of money. And even in their will, they gave him an annuity. So basically he was funded for his entire life out of this oil fortune of these mother and daughter duo. So next slide. So thanks to Caroline Lloyd and her mother, they funded his first trip around the world. And he basically left California in 1923. I think his congregation also contributed to the trip. And he returned a year later via New York. But he'd been through Korea, China, India, Burma, and he collected over 400 photographs and numerous books on this trip. So this book, or this trip, combined with his other research, forms the basis of his greatest work, which we know is The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And just before some of you got here, we're just talking about that book. That is, I don't know, maybe I'm exaggerating, but maybe next to The Secret Doctrine, it's probably one of the most famous books in spirituality. It inspired so many people to get on the spiritual path. It's not really a book you read, it's more like an encyclopedia. It combines beautiful, beautiful images on one plate and kind of the story of that particular group or mystical tradition or being. So if you don't have to read the book, you can just sort of leaf through it, and whatever interests you, you can just read that particular section. So it's a very accessible book, but it was more than 7 years in the making, this book. So between his public appearances, he was doing this kind of research, myth, magic, symbols, and he produced this gorgeous book, very concise essays, colorful renderings, and this book cost over $150,000 to make because of the pictures. The images are spectacular. And if you've ever bought one, it's very expensive if you buy the large. You can get a black and white version, soft cover, but in the hard cover with the colored plates, it's very expensive. I was just saying I co-owned a copy with my friend Paolo Greco, and he loaned it to someone else. Everybody brought it today to show you, but it's quite a spectacular book. So he was able to finance this through both his benefactors, but also through subscriptions. He pre-sold copies of the book. So he was able to do, I think, something that anybody else who was told, you know, in 19, whatever it was, 30 something, that you're going to produce a book, or 20s, that costs $150,000, that'd be like $1 million today. So, you know, he really had this ability. Maybe Ganesh was on his side, but he could really get things done. So I mentioned here that we see the role of 7. So at 21, so 3 times 7, he starts the book, and by 28, he finishes it. And this is almost like his complete life work, and he's already done it by age 27. So we see that he's recapitulating whatever mastership that he had in previous lives. He's recapitulating it, and he's doing it very quickly. So he dedicated the secret teachings to the proposition that concealed within the emblematic figures, allegories, and rituals of the ancients is a secret doctrine concerning the inner mysteries of life, which doctrine has been preserved in toto among a small band of initiated minds. And he signed the first copy, and he dedicated it to Sidney Brownson, which you remember was his very first teacher, who at this time he was quite sick and he was in his 80s. So that kind of, you know, was honoring his first teacher. Next slide. So he comes right back from this opus that he's just produced, and he writes a book that is kind of a companion in more of a text form to the images and very short essays that are in the Secret Teachings of the Ages. And this book is called Lectures on Ancient Philosophy. So by then, he's extremely well known. Everyone wants a copy of this book. His audience calls him Maestro. And he's starting to get the kind of coverage that would swell anyone's head. So in a magazine article, he's referred to as the greatest sage in America, and he's compared to Albert Einstein. He's like being told he's the Albert Einstein of spirituality. Los Angeles Examiner in 1930 described him as an original, distinct, in a class by himself. So again, we see these astrological influences coming through in his life. Next slide. Yeah. So I said his life was pretty charmed. Yes, that is true in his public life, but in his private life, he had nothing but difficulty. So he marries his first wife. She was his stenographer, and she was basically the one who was taking notes as he was dictating. And he did this most of his life. Most of his life, he didn't type or write anything down longhand. He always dictated his books. And he had I don't know, a thing about writing. I think he was told that that was not a good thing to do. So he would always do, but you know, his mind was so fluid that he could, speak. Some of us have trouble speaking complete sentences sometimes. He could do it, with ease. And so a stenographer would just, be taking everything down as he spoke. So he married his secretary, and this was just at the moment he's becoming famous. So he is out, being a guest lecturer. He's being called to speak here, speak there. And it's like his career has taken off. He's a hot ticket. He's being asked to speak on the lecture circuit all over the US. And she's alone, home, nothing to do. And she gets depressed and she commits suicide. So this is a shock to him. This goes against his own metaphysical principles, but it was also, I think he was a little naive and really had no concept of what marriage was all about. So it's a shock. And if we look at these kinds of shocks, this could be also an initiatory shock that might actually get him to open up his heart. So far, what we've seen of him is highly intellectual, but we haven't really seen, a warm, caring, loving kind of person. And I think this kind of shifts his, and as we say, opens up his heart and his emotional body. Next slide, please. So now he's quite famous. He works very hard. He goes on a 6-month lecture campaign to the largest cities across the US. He goes on radio in New York and Mexico. And then he's called to a meeting, or he's invited in 1934 to a meeting of the World Fellowship of Faiths. What you don't get in his story is that he ever suffered at all during the Depression. It was almost like the Depression didn't affect him. He just kept going. And here he meets a very interesting fellow by the name of, Younghusband, Sir Francis Younghusband. Now this fellow was a British colonel, lieutenant colonel. He served mostly in India, and he led in 1904 a British expedition to Tibet, which was almost like an invasion of Tibet actually at the time. But he was very well regarded in British circles. He became the president of the Geographical Society. He also traveled extensively through China. He found one of the first passages through the Karakoram range. So he was quite a famous explorer. And he too had an initiatory moment when he was in Tibet. Sort of a week when he was just in another realm. And as he put it, he was experiencing this mystical experience and love for the whole world. So he obviously had something happen to him while he was in Tibet. So the other interesting thing about Paul at this time is that he also would speak at the Rourke Museum in New York City. But I couldn't find any reference to him ever having met the Rourkes, although he certainly had a lot of respect for them, and I think they did for him as well. Next slide. So his next step is the founding of the Philosophical Research Society, the PRS, which is still there to this day. You can go to Los Angeles and visit it. Basically, he felt that academia was far too materialistic. And really, even to this day, we don't really see spirituality other than the more traditional religion being integrated into university talks and lectures, maybe a little bit more today, but certainly not back in the 30s. And so he wanted a center, he said, the new center of a new way of life in the midst of the Pacific theater of the future. He said it would teach practical idealism. And also it was a place for him to display his over 100,000 books. So he's got quite an extensive library by this. He felt it would be the guiding light for the city. So they break ground in 1934, and the building, he founds the organization in 1934. They buy a piece of real estate, and they, of course, lay the cornerstone at a very auspicious time. And then at the opening, he says, this society is dedicated to the ensoulment of all arts and sciences and crafts. In harmony with the classical point of view, we feel there is a pressing need for a non-aligned institution without creed or dogma, where persons of all beliefs can seek a better understanding of life's plan. The society requires no membership, and no one is expected to accept any arbitrary dogma. He says, we are all here to grow, to become better and more useful. So that sort of became his home base for the rest of his life. And if you go to the next slide, there's a picture here of his library. So through all these time, he's been collecting books and artifacts from young husband, yes. He got something called the Ripley Scroll, which is a 20-foot long hand-painted manuscript related to alchemy. So this is, I sort of, after reading all this, I've always wanted to go there. I think you could easily have a fabulous vacation in California, going to this place and going to all of these spiritual centers like Ojai and some of the other wonderful spiritual centers in California. But he kept up with his rare book collecting, and now he was a collector. He had the resources, and so when a collection came up, he could go and bid on it and acquire it. And this is a place where people can go to this day on research and write books on spiritual and esoteric topics. Next slide. And these were also the glory days of Hollywood, all through, when you think of the early pictures in the 30s, through to early television in the 50s and the 60s. He was a celebrity by this point, and he was also well known by other celebrities. They say that Elvis Presley drove to the Philosophical Society, stayed in his car while his driver went in and got Manley P to sign a copy of the Ageless and the Secret Teachings of the Ages. So he thought, well, how can I influence? I think he really had this mission that he wants to spread spiritual ideas and spiritual concepts. And we even know that the hierarchy at the time through Blavatsky was trying to get, shake humanity out of this materialism and try and get them to see that there's another world beyond the physical. So Manley P. Hall said, well, how can we do this? And he thought, well, Hollywood and through motion pictures and then again through television, we can do this. So he actually started writing scripts and treatments and sending them off to his friends in Hollywood, and they loved them. But while he was a great writer, bringing esoteric ideas down to earth, he really wasn't the world's greatest screenwriter. So very few of them got picked up, and only one of them was ever produced. It was this one called "When Were You Born?" and it's basically a murder mystery. I haven't seen it, but it uses astrology to kind of solve the murder mystery. And it was unfortunately a big flop. So his one script that ended up getting produced. So I guess that's the fate of many script writers. But he was good friends with Bela Lugosi. We know he did a whole, he was starred with Boris Karloff and a whole bunch of horror films. And it was said he was friends with Gene Roddenberry and influenced Star Trek. He was friends with Sidney Poitier. They did a series together on Poitier meets Plato. So he had and he and Burl Ives, they did a public television series. So he was very well known, and I think a lot of celebrities were always kind of seeking him out to be connected with him. Next slide. Now, this is also one of his great books or well-known books. Has anybody read this one? Secret. So he wrote this in, I think it was about, been in the 30s, but he made a prediction in this book. He said that in June, he made this in June of 1940, he says, America, he says, will not become seriously involved in European affairs before 1942. And of course, we know Pearl Harbor was December 1941. Prior to that, there were some static ideological conflict, but nothing serious. After 1942, he doesn't make a guess. And he never envisions the defeat of England nor any economic collapse in the United States. That was just, basically at the start of World War II. And then he talks about in this book a secret plan for America, one he says that was devised in Egypt 3,000 years ago. And he says American democracy has been part of the divine plan. He says it's the duty of the ruler is to protect for all life the right to live well, to think, to dream, to hope, and to aspire. So basically, he was similar in a way to Francis Bacon. And he brought in the idea that there's spiritual teachers and guides for the Americas, the American colonies, and that it was an important event when the Declaration of Independence was signed. So now we have his second wife, and this marriage actually, although it lasted longer, it didn't go any better than the first marriage. His second wife was, we might call her a bit of a nut bar. You know how we can have spiritual, have groupies in for rock stars. Well, she was a groupie, and she actually dumped her husband and her children and followed him around and finally got a divorce, and they got married. And after they got married, she was just horrible, just treated him like crap all the time. And he took it. He never really fight with her in public. He was always really, he just sort of, took it all in. And yelling at him, and he just slumps in his chair and pretends to snooze. So, it wasn't a happy marriage, although it did last until his death. So I mentioned one of his predictions about America. He also would cite the writings of Nostradamus about the period from 1960 to 65. So people were, during that period, I think people were starting to lose interest in what he had to say. But he kind of warned ahead of time about political change, social change, cults, and of course, the tremendous pressure of the release of knowledge through electronic fields. And he also warned about the menace of war and also about the dangers that a science might bring. So again, he seemed kind of prophetic when in November of '62, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis. And furthermore, he predicted problems. Now, we probably just read the chart for John Kennedy, but he said, whenever you have Saturn in the 10th house conjunct a planet Neptune, oh goodness, you always have at least a remote danger of assassination. You have danger to life, you have danger to health, and so on. And so, of course, we know that Kennedy was assassinated in November of '63, and he made this prediction in October of '63. So there you go. So let's look a little bit at his legacy. This is him very late in life. He received a sort of an honorary doctorate. He saw himself as a scholar, one who seeks knowledge for its own sake. He was also a teacher, and he was there to bestow on his students his knowledge and his insight. But he was very practical, as we saw. He always was trying to bring things down. It was clear, it was understandable, it was accessible. He believed in the value of teachings of the great avatars and mystics from the past. And he really could see, I think, the dark side of scientific progress, materialism. He took mystical wisdom that awakened and nourished the soul. This was where he was focused. He was really an Aquarian. It was very early Aquarian, and he was really there, I think, to help found the Aquarian age and grounded in that specific area, which was California. So his output over 6 decades hasn't been equal. He's done more than 200 books, hundreds of essays, 8,000 public lectures. And really, I don't think anybody has ever matched him on his knowledge for Eastern religion, Freemasonry, mythology, world cultures, and so on. And I think the important thing was that for many people, if you read about sort of the more modern spiritual leaders, they were inspired by Manley P, right? They were awakened when they opened that book. You know, maybe they were sitting on the floor in the bookstore in the library, but that was something that, you know, connected them with their soul and kind of energized them and got them on the spiritual path. So what do I think his spiritual status and mission was? Well, my hypothesis is that he had 3 important responsibilities that he was given for his time on Earth. He was to make the wisdom of the ages accessible to everyone, establish a prototype or be one of the people establishing the prototype of a new civilization in California. And he was helped the United States to recognize and realize its sacred destiny. And I think some of you had said you've seen his lectures on YouTube, and they're equally inspired today by his knowledge and his ability to speak. Next slide, please. I think I'm doing okay on time, aren't I doing? I'm drawing to a close. That's good. So, you know, we can only guess at what his rays are, but I would hypothesize that he's comes out of the second ray ashram, and particularly clearly on the wisdom line. That he's part of this North American ashram, but he also has a strong 7th ray. So why do I say that? I think I see that in his connection with
manifest.
Yeah. And he was also really connected with the Rosicrucians and the Masons, which are, you know, ceremonial kind of orders. So this idea of ceremony was always important to him. And you saw how he loved to have a cross. And he in his very late in life, he's inducted as a 33rd degree Mason. So these are all important things to him. So that's why I'm giving him a 2-7, which coincidentally, and my point to why he's born in Canada, are also, we would hypothesize the rays for Canada 2-7, whereas the US is 2-6. He was a meticulous scholar, and he amassed this huge library. So again, the 2nd ray soul with the 7th ray personality. Now, Michael Robbins, who, if you know him from the University of the 7 Rays, he gives him also a 2-7 in the Tapestry of the Gods. So we're going to say he comes out of the 2-7 ashram. We also might say he's got a 3rd ray mental body. He has a very abstract mind, and he can hold in his mind so much information. And maybe he was really like Blavatsky. Maybe he wasn't really carrying this in his own personal mind or even his own mental field. He was probably tapping into the Buddhic plane when he was speaking, and that allowed him to speak, you know, extemporaneously on so many different topics. You remember Blavatsky was writing on topics she had no personal knowledge of whatsoever. She's tapping into either someone on the other side who's knowledgeable and they're dictating that to her, or she's just pulling it directly from the Buddhic plane. So giving him a 3rd ray mental body and perhaps a 2nd ray emotional body. You know, we see about how he related to his wife. You know, he was a little bit on the passive side, but it comes to dealing with his wife. So we're giving him a secondary emotional body. And finally, a sixth grade physical body. He was extremely overweight late in life, and that's typically the character of the sixth grade body. So who might his master on the second grade? And name because it's and this in California. So that kind of trauma, we could put his recapitulation of the none compared to what, say, Blavatsky would face or Alice Bailey faced, you know, they were always struggling.
I'm a little curious just from like previous ideas I had about him. I'm very accustomed to him speaking about right conduct, integrity, moralistic things here. I was unaware of his wealth throughout his life. And I'm surprised to not hear more about maybe charity or, you know, goodwill, like community service, things like that. I don't know if that was something that was major in his life, but
Yeah.
it seems like something major in his teaching.
Well, he wasn't wealthy, so let's just take that off the table.
Oh.
He just was well supported, right? So he was never wealthy, but he was very generous with his time. And, you know, it didn't cost much to be a member of that organization. I'm not even sure if it cost anything to be a member. So he was very generous with his time, generous with his knowledge, generous with wisdom, right? It wasn't one of these groups. And as a matter of fact, he would speak against, and very powerfully, he would speak against some of these very negative groups who would charge you a fortune to come to some, you know, event to learn, secret deep, you know, wisdom, right? He said, no way, we're giving it to you for next to nothing or nothing, right? So he was very generous.
You know, in his PRS, if there was like a code of conduct or anything, or like rules for right conduct or anything?
No, I'm not sure, really. I'd have to go on their site and look at it, but he was, you know, what he was trying to do, he was trying to extract from the wisdom traditions and the spiritual traditions of the ages and provide that, what he called the philosophical, you know, moral basis for leading a good life in the modern world. So he was trying to do that.
I think his charity was in his works itself. I mean, that's
Exactly.
priceless. How many? 8,000 lectures?
Yeah, yeah.
200 books?
Yeah.
How many other essays? That's ridiculous.
In his lifetime, the money that was left in him was for his lifetime. It wasn't for his legacy, to leave to others.
Oh, yeah, and believe me, there was a whole fight and scramble between his wife and his caregiver. It was tawdry. His ending was very tawdry.
Well, this is actually what I asked.
Yeah.
What's surprising to me is to hear that he had such helpful relationships.
Yeah.
And he wasn't lucky in love, it sounds.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
know? And, you
But
know,
maybe if he had me, he wouldn't have been as prolific.
I
Exactly.
agree, yes. I agree. I just found it an interesting thing, and I was wondering if there's more information to that, because I feel like relationships, societies, interactions are a great
Mhm.
indicator of conduct and moral behavior.
Well, you know, I do think he had a bit of an ego, there's no doubt about it. You know, I think he was the performer, so he liked to be the center of attention. And like many spiritual people, you know, I could liken him to Michael Robbins, who I knew very well. You know, they don't like business people coming in. He had so many people that would come into the organization and said, let me help you, I can organize this better, we can do this, you know, and he would always just sort of, oh, yeah, but he'd be really passive aggressive. You know, he actually would never give up control.
But he also didn't care about money.
No, he didn't really care that much about money.